just want to take a moment to thank everybody who's participated today. I also want to encourage you. Um, half of our folks are out in the alley washing cars, so make sure you stop out there before you go and get your car washed. Also, take the opportunity to walk around a little bit. We've had a lot that's been going on. We have our parlor that has been finished, completed this week, so please take a look at that. I'm trying to see who all's here. Most everybody was in the first service, but Phil has been working on that really hard, and thank you very much, Phil, and the guys that have been working on that. But also, make sure you circle around and get to our new nursery, because we have had an influx of babies. Isn't it wonderful? And we needed to make sure that we have a safe place for them to be. So now we're going to be able to have a toddler nursery and an infant nursery. And the MYF came in a couple weeks, and they worked on the new nursery. So please stop by and see that, and thank them also for their work. And so I'm not drinking any of the water around here, but you're welcome to if you'd like. And because I'm not sure that stuff's kind of catching. In fact, we're going to talk about that a little bit here in our scripture passage today about babies that God promises to people. And so please take the opportunity to stop. Laura Hughes was the one who gathered all the youth group together to be able to get that project done. And so if you see her, she's helping in the nursery this morning. Please make sure you thank her as well. Just to put it in a little bit perspective, I think it is so cool what God's been doing and how God's been moving, because we were able to get air conditioning this year. Can I get a praise Jesus from that? Yahoo! And we were able to do that because of the gift of somebody who left the church in their will. And because of that, we've been able to move forward. A lot of the changes we've made have been underwritten by people who are no longer with us. And so we were able to go to that next place as a church because people were generous, well, even beyond their years. And so we take those gifts from those who came before us, we add our sweat to it, and lay down floors and paint walls, and all in hopes for a new generation. And so it's a wonderful thing that God's doing in our midst, and I just want to thank everybody that's been a part of that as well. So last week we started our series on Abraham. We talked about how Abraham was going against the tide of his generation and how God called him to a place to go even beyond where his father had gone, to take the next step into his faith and say, okay, Dad got you this far, but I want you to go further into the land that I'm going to show you and what it's like for us to be countercultural. Today we're going to continue on with Abraham's story. Now, I'm not going to read all of it for you, but I want you to read it when you get home. You can have, there's this on the phone, your phone, if you look up the Bible app, you can get it and download it for free. Maybe you have a Bible at home that you've put on your shelf someplace. Get it out, dig it out, and read for yourself. Starting at Genesis chapter 12. Genesis is the first book of the Bible. And go to chapter 12 and start reading, and you're going to get the story of Abraham. And last week we talked about how God called him to Canaan, and this that we have today is the story that happens right after that. So the Lord said to Abram, "Leave your native country and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and you will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt, and all the families on the earth will be blessed through you." All the families of the earth will be blessed through you. This is the promise that God has given to Abraham. He didn't just give him instructions. He didn't say, go do what I tell you. He said, go follow me, but I'm going to give you something as you go. I'm going to lead you, and it's not just because I arbitrarily woke up today and decided that I don't want you here, I want you over here. He said, I have a purpose that I'm going to fulfill through you. I want to bless this entire world through you, and I'm going to start by making you a great nation. I'm going to start by blessing you in order to bless the entire world. And so he gives Abraham this promise. He said, Abraham, I'm going to make you a great nation. Now that sounds great on this side of history, but at that particular point in time, Abraham didn't have any kids. And so that's going to be new. That's going to be a stretch to say, God, can you really do this? It's been so long that we haven't been able to have kids. And now you're going to give us a new baby? Couldn't you have done it when I was 24? instead of when I was 74, but okay, that's fine. And so God gives him this promise, I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to bless those who bless you, curse those who treat you with contempt. The entire world is going to be blessed through you. So what do you think happens next? Abraham sets out and everybody's thrilled and nothing bad ever happens to him, right? Not so much. That isn't the way life works, is it? Well, guess what? It's not the way faith works either. He says, I want you to venture out. I want you to step out. I'm going to be with you. And then the very next thing that happens is it says, and then there was a famine in the land. He just arrives to the land that God has for him. He just stakes his claim, and all of a sudden there's a famine. Now, it's not like famine that we have today. If we get a famine in Ohio, we just get our produce from California, right? This is not how it worked back then. If there was a famine in your country, you had to pick up and move to go to where there was food. You had to pick up and move so that you could feed your family. No such thing as putting down roots for years and years and years. If the famine happened, you had to go and find food. And so the logical place to do that, if you're in Canaan, is to go to Egypt. And so he went down to Egypt, and it said, we learned something about Sarah in the midst of all this. Apparently, she was quite a looker. And he goes, you know, honey, you're so beautiful that when we get down into Egypt, I've heard about those folks down there, you know. Why don't you tell them you're my sister? She's my sister. No, she's my wife. No, she's my sister. She's my wife. Comedy routines could be made about this one episode in their life right there. But she does it. Well, back in that day, they had this way that they dealt with conflict, and that was this. If you move into town, and I'm the Pharaoh, and you come in and I'm afraid, that's a pretty decent-sized family, and you have some cattle and some sheep and some goats, and you might even be able to muster an army and overthrow me. So rather than do that, I'm going to marry with you, intermarry with you. We're going to make an alliance so that I know that you're not going to try to depose me. So he looks at all the people in their clan, and what's he decide? Sarah? Well, she's not taken. She's your sister, right? And so she moves into Pharaoh's harem. Well, it could be that things were different back then, but I'm kind of guessing not. That if Abraham's going to be the father of a great nation and they're going to have a child, they probably have to be at least in close proximity. And here she is living in Pharaoh's harem. I'm thinking that's a glitch. I'm thinking that's a setback for the team. What is going on? You've given me this promise, and then there's a famine. So I can't even stay in the land where I've put down stakes. And then we get there, and Abraham somehow turns into this quasi-coward and is afraid that they're going to take his life, so he's willing to ship off his wife into Pharaoh's harem. And you're like, is this ever going to take place? Is this promise ever going to come true? I mean, come on. And I think in the midst of this, God's probably working on Abraham going, Abraham, I need you to think about this, buddy. I told you I was going to make you into a great nation, and you can't be shipping your wife off to somebody else if this is going to work out. So God sends a plague on Abraham, or on Pharaoh's, all of his people, and Pharaoh finally figures out something's wrong. And he goes back to Abraham and he says, dude, what are you doing? Why don't you just tell me that this is your wife, not your sister? And he ships her home to Abraham, and he sends a few goats and sheep and cattle and everything just as a way of apologizing. Sorry for the misunderstanding. And in the midst of it, Abraham learns this lesson that said, if God has promised you something, it's not about the land, and it's not about the rain, and it's not about the famine, and it's not about the Pharaoh. God's the one who's responsible for fulfilling this. Now, I would love to tell you that when God puts a call on your life or gives you a promise that it's always going to go well, that there's never going to be a hiccup. between when he promises you and when it's fulfilled. But because Abraham's the father of our faith, his story is about showing us how to have faith, even in the midst of adversity. Right out of the box, are you going to trust God with this promise, or are you going to take matters into your own hands? Are you going to trust God, or are you going to take matters into your own hands? How many times do we see teenagers do this? I don't like it at home. I don't seem to have a future, but I bet if I could just have a baby, everything would be okay. And we manipulate, and we finagle, and we end up getting ourselves into a deeper problem instead of trusting that God has a future for us that's different. How many times do we try to make things at work go exactly our way? Try to make them fit into our plans instead of trusting that God has something for us? How many times do we freak out like Abraham did? And we try to make everything go exactly the way we think it should, instead of stopping to say, God gave us a promise. Things aren't necessarily going to work out exactly the way you think they should. I had that happen this week, by chance. I've been fighting a sinus infection, and I got to tell you, that is never pretty. I look like I'm 7 years old again. My nose gets real red, and it's awful, and I walk around with tissues. And see those little tissues in your pew? I went through 2 boxes of those in 2 weeks, period of time. It was not pretty, okay? I didn't look like a bag lady. I looked like the tissue lady. I'd stuffed them in my purse, you know, and had to sit in a workshop all week long, and that wasn't pretty either. So we're towards the end of the week. We go into the Kroger. We had to go pick up a couple things, and I decide while I'm there I need to run to the restroom. So I go and, of course, find the one stall. Well, it happened to be the handicap stall. Well, if you know anything about the handicap stall, it's about 30 yards away from the door. The commode's about 30 yards away from the door. And I get in and sit down and decide, uh-oh, there's no toilet paper. And can't really even ask anybody for it because she'd had to throw it like a football to get it in the stall. And I'm like, I am stuck. Until I remembered tissues. I've just spent 2 weeks with my purse stuffed full of tissues. That never happens. You know what? I'm never going to complain about a sinus infection ever again because God delivered me with tissues in my purse. You see, we get this idea that we're going to judge whether things are good or bad. I don't want another sinus infection, but at that particular moment, I was happy to have it. So was that good or was that bad? Or do we just stop trying to judge that stuff for ourselves? Do we just stop trying to figure it all out and be the person who gets to judge good or bad and just say, God, I'm going to let you decide those things. And I'm going to trust you. And I'm going to believe that the promise that you have, the promise that you've given, is not going to be thwarted by any of my external circumstances. Whether it looks like famine, whether it looks like Pharaoh, whether it looks like fear, I'm going to trust you to be the one responsible to fulfill this. You see, when we begin to fear and we begin to finagle, we begin to manipulate, it shows our lack of trust in God. Our lack of trust in God. So what happens after the whole Pharaoh thing? Well, you get to chapter 13, and it looks like maybe Abraham's learned a little bit more. Maybe this is starting to sink in, because he gets into a conflict with his nephew Lot and their sheep herders And they start arguing back and forth because their flocks are getting mingled together and it's hard to get them watered and get food for them and everything. They've gone back to Canaan, and Abraham says, you know what, Lot, we're family. We need to stop squabbling like this. So you take whatever part you want and I'll go the opposite direction. Now Lot is not stupid. He looks and he sees the Jordan Valley, and it's lush and it's green, and a great place to have a pasture for his flocks. And he looks over this way and it's kind of dry and arid, and there's little scrubby bushes and not so much grass. And which do you think he takes? Of course, he takes the Jordan Valley. He says, this is where I want, you can have what's left. And you say, Pastor Vicki, this is great, but what's this have to do with me? Well, you know, there's going to come a day when somebody else gets promoted over you, and they get the better territory at work, and they seem to get the bigger share of customers, or they get to get the overtime. Or in a congregation this size, I bet there's at least one person, and probably more like 12, who it was your sibling that got more of the inheritance. And you're still bitter years later. Where families have been divided for generations because somebody found a way to get more than their fair share. Or maybe the boss just doesn't seem to like us, and everybody else seems to get ahead but us. But Abraham could risk being generous because he understood it was God's responsibility to fulfill the promise. He could risk saying, I'm not going to fight you over this. Take what you want. Take whichever part you want. I'm going to be okay. I'm going to be okay. I can risk being generous because the God who took care of me yesterday, and the God who got me through the famine, and the God who got me through whatever brain cramp that was that ended up with my wife being with Pharaoh, and the God who got me back to here, and the God who has seen me through up to today is also going to be the God who's going to see me through tomorrow. And I can risk being generous with you because of that. Now you think we're home free, right? Abraham's growing, he's figuring this out, and everything's going to go okay. Well, no, of course not. Because that's not how faith works. And so what happens? And then Lot gets himself into trouble and needs rescued, so Abraham has to raise up an army to go get him. And then he ends up, and he needs rescued again, and then, this king wants to go to war, and all these things that keep happening, that keep standing in the way of God's promise. All of these things that keep looking like setbacks. But there's something very important that's going on in all of this time. Abraham's faith is growing. Abraham's learning what it looks like to be right in the middle of a situation where we have the choice to trust God or not. He's figuring it out, what it means to be a man of faith, and what it means to not just be a man of faith, but to be a man of promise. So let me ask you this. What promise has God put on your life? Now, okay, I got to say all the, disclaimer part. Of course, God's talking about, you get to go to heaven when you die. Woohoo. All right, you got your fire insurance, you got that all handled, we're good. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm saying is, what specific promise does God have for you? What call has he put on your life? What call has he given you? Because it is something that you're going to want to be a part of, but it's also something that's going to bless everybody around you because of. What specific call, what specific promise has God given you? Probably the hardest job I have as a pastor is convincing you of that truth. Because if you believed that you had a promise on your life, do you really think you'd be irritated at the person standing in front of you in Starbucks? Yes, I have a promise from God. Yes, God's going to do something great in and through me, and I'm going to lose it right here in the middle of Starbucks because you're taking too long ordering a triple macchiato with extra this and extra that. And that doesn't happen when you understand what your promise is. When you understand what your call is. Waking up every morning and wondering, gosh, do I have to just pay bills until I die? That doesn't happen when you understand God's promise for you. I'm convinced that much, not all, but much of our disappointment and much of our depression is because we lose touch with who we are in God's eyes, with who we truly are in God's eyes. What's the promise that God has for you? And then what's the obstacle that's standing in the way? What's the adversity that has come your way that made you lose sight of it? Or the obstacle was so tall you can't see it anymore? You've heard me give the illustration before, the story that a few years ago I almost left the ministry. I knew something was wrong. I knew that I wasn't exactly where I wanted to be. Didn't feel like I was where I should be. And no matter how hard I tried, I just couldn't make any forward progress. And I knew God had a call on my life, and I knew God had a purpose for me, but it sure didn't look like I was fulfilling it at the moment. And I remember one day very vividly, I walked into the bathroom and I started to put on my makeup. And why God talks to me when I put on my makeup, I don't understand. But I was quiet and I was reflecting. And I heard this impression, not an audible voice, but this impression that said, what if 2 years from now, your situation is so different that this will be worth it? What if 2 years from now, this is worth it? I had no idea what that meant. No idea what that could possibly be. But I said, okay, God, I'll hang on. I will hang on, and I will trust that you're doing something. 2 years later was 2 years ago when I came here. 2 years later was 2 years ago when I got the privilege of being your pastor. And I remember the night I was talking with Dave, and I said, Dave, tonight all of that became worth it. All of that became worth it. The years of feeling like God had forgotten me, the years of feeling like I was just marching in place, the years of feeling like I was a square peg in a round hole, they became worth it the day God fulfilled his promise. And I couldn't truly appreciate the promise until we'd gone through the adversity. We'd gone through the adversity. Imagine what it's going to be like for Abraham when he finally gets to see the fulfillment of God's promise after famine, after war, after stupid mistakes, after things beyond his control and things that were in his control. And he finally gets to see what God's done. Now, the question is, what is God doing for you in your life? What's the promise that God wants to fulfill in you? And what's standing in the way? What's the obstacle that's standing in the way? I want you to read Genesis 12, 13, 14, 15. Read through Abraham's story, because time and time again, he's put in situations where he can either choose to believe God's promise, or he can try to make it work out himself. And you watch him grow over time, and you watch him grow through those circumstances until he finally gets it. And this, in chapter 15, is what was written about Abraham. And Abraham believed God, and it was counted as righteousness for him. Abraham believed God, and the Lord counted him as righteous. Now, this is the guy that had the brain cramp who ended up with his wife of Pharaoh. This is the guy who could say, Lot, take whatever land you want, that'll be fine. This is the guy who could give it away. This is the guy who could screw it up. This is the guy who went through all of that. And what the Bible records about him, about the truth of his life, about the most important thing for us to remember, is that he believed God. He didn't say he believed God perfectly, but he believed God. He got there. And God credited it to him as righteousness. Now let me put that into words maybe we would use today. There is an eternal difference that's made when you hold on to your faith. There is an eternal difference that's made when you hold on in the midst of adversity. There's an eternal difference that happens for you and your family and your community when you hold on to your faith. It gets credited as righteousness. What's standing in the way of you believing God's promise? But you don't understand, Pastor Vicki. You don't understand what your past is. Well, let me ask you this. Did your wife end up in Pharaoh's harem? I think we're okay. Did you end up lying and cheating? I think we're okay. Did you end up getting it right and end up getting it wrong, probably on the same day? I think we're okay. Because it's also not about you and your past. It's about the promise and your belief in the one person who can keep that promise. I want to pray for you this morning. And as we do, if you don't have a sense of what that promise is for you, then that's your challenge for this week. To figure out what it is that God is promising for you. What is your calling? And when you understand what that is, what's standing in the way? And then that's your challenge. To hold on in the midst of the adversity, in the midst of the pain. Hold on in the midst of your fear and mistrust. That God has promised. His promise will come true. Let's pray. God, I want to thank you that you are a God of promise. It's so easy to believe that it's for everybody else. But God, I ask that you would give us the understanding that it's for each one of us today. That you have a calling, that you have a purpose that's going to bless not only us, but our family, our community. It's going to bless everyone in our lives when we follow. But God, we're also scared. And there seem to be things bigger than us that are standing in the way of that happening. And so it is this day that we say, we will believe that the promise keeper is bigger than anything we're going to face. Forgive us when we get it wrong. Remind us when we get it right. And we will praise you in the midst of all of it. In the name of Christ. Amen.